happened to me about 3 years ago during a trip I took with my daughter through Arizona. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 41 at the time, and my daughter, Emily, was 15. I've been divorced from her mother since Emily was 9, and around that time we had gotten into the habit of taking a short trip together during summer vacation. I lived in Henderson, Nevada, and that year we decided to drive through northern Arizona for a few days, passing through Flagstaff and some smaller towns before heading back home. We hadn't booked all of our hotels because we wanted to decide our route as we went, which I now consider a pretty stupid decision. That night, I had been driving for hours and was much more tired than I wanted to admit. It was already after 10 when I realized that continuing on to the next larger town wouldn't be a good idea. We found a roadside motel shortly after leaving a small town whose name I don't even really remember. It was one of those old single-story L-shaped motels, with the room doors opening directly onto the parking lot. There was a red sign near the highway, a few vending machines beside the office, and maybe 4 cars parked in the entire place. The heat was still ridiculous even at that hour. When I got out of the car, I immediately felt that hot, dry air against my face, and the asphalt still seemed to be giving off the heat it had absorbed during the day. Emily complained about the place as soon as she saw it, but I told her we'd only be there for a few hours, we'd sleep and then leave early. There was an older man behind the front desk watching television. I paid for a room with 2 beds, got a key card, and we parked practically right in front of our door. Our room was number 17. The inside was exactly what I expected for the price. 2 beds, brown carpet, a small television sitting on a dresser, and an old air conditioner installed below the window. There was a strong smell of cleaning products mixed with stale cigarette smoke, even though a sign on the door said it was a non-smoking room. Emily immediately went to charge her phone while I put our bags near the second bed and turned on the air conditioner. The machine started making a horrible noise, but at least it blew cold air. It was while I was closing the curtains that I heard a television in the room next door. Our room was between 16 and 18, but the sound seemed to be clearly coming from 18 on the right. I didn't think anything of it. A few minutes later, we heard something hit the wall, and Emily said she hoped our neighbor wasn't going to stay awake all night. I told her that if it bothered us, we'd call the front desk. We continued organizing our things and getting ready for bed. Every now and then we could hear the television through the wall, usually voices from some show followed by periods when the volume became so low that it almost disappeared. I also heard footsteps 2 or 3 times. They were slow and seemed to go from one end of the room next door to the other. That didn't seem strange to me either. What caught my attention was that when I quickly went outside to get 2 bottles of water from the car, I looked at room 18 and noticed that the curtains were completely closed and there was no car parked in front of it. Even so, I could see a very faint strip of light underneath the door. I went back inside without mentioning it to Emily because, at the time, I figured whoever was staying there had simply parked somewhere else in the motel. It must have been close to 11 when Emily started paying more attention to the room next door. I was sitting on the bed answering a few messages when she turned off the television in our room and asked if I could hear that. Without our TV on, the sound through the wall became much clearer. The television in room 18 was still playing, but there was something else along with it. It sounded like someone handling small objects, maybe opening a drawer or putting something down on a table. Then we heard 2 footsteps and a short creak. I said it was probably just another guest and told her not to pay attention, because the more she listened, the more every little sound would bother her. Emily rolled her eyes and went to get a clean t-shirt from her bag. That was when she bent down near the wall separating the 2 rooms and suddenly stopped. I asked what was wrong. She pointed to an area near the baseboard, partially hidden by the side of the bed. There was a small hole in the wall, barely larger than the tip of a pencil. It looked old, as if something had once been screwed into the wall there and later removed. I crouched down to look at it and didn't think much of it. On our side, there was a rough edge of drywall, and inside there was only darkness. Emily said that while she was getting the t-shirt, she'd seen something move past the hole on the other side. I asked what exactly she'd seen, and she said she didn't know. According to her, at first the hole looked dark, and then it became light for a moment, as if something had moved away from it. That made me a little uncomfortable, but I still thought it could simply have been the light in the room next door changing when someone walked near the wall. I took a piece of paper from the table, folded it a few times and placed it over the hole, securing it with some tape I had in my backpack. I did it more to reassure Emily than because I actually believed someone was watching us. But while I was crouched there, I heard footsteps on the other side, and they stopped directly in the same area of the wall where I was. I stayed completely still for a few seconds. I didn't hear anything else besides the television and our air conditioner vibrating near the window. I stood up and told Emily I was going to the front desk to ask if they could move us to another room. She wanted to come with me, but the office was less than a minute away on foot, and I didn't see any reason to make her put her shoes back on and go outside into that heat again. I told her to lock the door behind me and not open it for anyone. As soon as I stepped outside, I looked directly at room 18. The door was closed and the strip of light was still visible underneath it. I walked to the front desk and found the same employee behind the counter. I explained that there was quite a bit of noise coming from the room next to ours and asked if he could move us to another room. He looked at the computer, asked for our room number, and then stared at the screen for a few seconds. Then he asked which side the noise was coming from. When I said room 18, he frowned and told me that room wasn't rented. I thought he'd misunderstood me and told him there was a television on inside. He said room 18 had been out of service since that afternoon because the air conditioner had stopped working and that nobody was supposed to be staying there. My first thought was that maybe an employee was using the room. I asked if someone from maintenance could be inside, and the man said not at that hour. He picked up a phone and tried calling someone while I stood at the counter, starting to feel genuinely worried. I asked if he was sure the room was empty. He turned the monitor slightly toward me and showed me a line where room 18 was marked as unavailable. I didn't understand all the codes on the screen, but it was clear there was no registered guest. At that moment, I immediately thought about the hole in the wall and what Emily had said she'd seen. I asked if someone could have a key to the room, and he said employees had access, but that it needed to be checked. I didn't even wait for him to finish the call. I told him my daughter was alone and practically ran out of the office. As I crossed the parking lot, I tried calling Emily. She didn't answer the first call. She didn't answer the second one either. I could already see our room and there was nobody outside, but that didn't make me feel any better. When I reached the door, I used my key card and went inside, calling her name. The room was empty. The bathroom door was closed, and I heard Emily say my name from inside. Her voice was quiet and shaking. I went over and asked her to open the door. When she unlocked it, she was barefoot, holding her phone with both hands, and had clearly been crying. The first thing she asked was whether I'd come back earlier and tried to get inside. I said no and asked what had happened. Emily told me that maybe a minute after I left, she heard someone stop outside. She thought I'd forgotten something. Then she heard a card being swiped through the lock. The lock made that little electronic beep and the door handle went down. The door actually opened a few inches before being stopped by the security latch I'd left in place. When she realized it wasn't me speaking outside, Emily ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and tried calling me. I looked at her phone and saw 2 calls to me that I hadn't noticed because I'd been running across the parking lot with my phone in my hand. I asked if she'd seen the person. She said no. She'd only heard the door hit the latch and then someone pull it closed again. While she was still explaining this to me, we heard a sharp sound through the wall. We both went silent. The television in room 18, which I could still hear very faintly, suddenly stopped. A few seconds later, the door to the room next door opened. I clearly recognized the creak because our doors made almost exactly the same sound. Then it slammed shut. There were quick footsteps along the exterior walkway, passing in front of our window and heading in the opposite direction from the front desk. I didn't go to the window. I grabbed Emily by the arm, took her back into the bathroom, and told her to stay there while I called the front desk and the police. The front desk employee answered almost immediately, and I told him that someone had just tried to enter our room and had then come out of room 18. His tone changed completely. He told me to lock the door and said he was already calling the police. I secured the safety latch again, pushed one of the chairs against the door more out of nervousness than because I actually thought it would stop anyone from getting in, and went back near the bathroom. Emily didn't want to come out. I stood between the bathroom door and the window, trying to listen for any movement outside. The air conditioner was making so much noise that I eventually turned it off, and the room became strangely quiet. Without it, I started noticing sounds from the parking lot that had been muffled before. A truck passing on the highway, some insect hitting the outside light fixture, and every now and then footsteps or cracking sounds that I couldn't locate. The heat started coming back almost immediately. I was sweating down my back and my mouth felt completely dry. I looked at the paper I'd placed over the small hole near the baseboard. It was no longer completely secured. One side of the tape had come loose and the paper was slightly raised. I don't know if that happened on its own because of the rough wall, or if someone had touched it from the other side, but I didn't go near it to check. I placed our larger suitcase on the floor in front of that section of the wall and told Emily to stay in the bathroom. About 2 minutes later, someone slowly passed in front of our window. I only saw a shadow crossing the narrow strip of light coming through the sides of the curtain. I couldn't tell whether it was the same person or another guest. I held the bathroom doorknob with one hand and waited for some kind of sound at our door. The person didn't try to come in this time. I heard the footsteps continue along the walkway and disappear. The police arrived maybe 7 or 8 minutes later, although it felt much longer to me. First, I saw the lights reflecting through the gaps in the curtains, and then I heard 2 voices outside. I called the front desk again before opening the door, just to confirm that they really were police officers. Once I was sure, I moved the chair, opened the latch, and let the 2 officers inside. Emily finally came out of the bathroom. One of them stayed with us while the other went to speak with the employee in check room 18. About 5 minutes later, he came back and asked me to go with him to the room next door, leaving Emily with the other officer. The room was empty. The television was on, but there was no sound at that point, and the room was unbelievably hot. The air conditioner really didn't work. There was a towel thrown over a chair, an open bottle of water on the nightstand, and an old backpack on the floor near the bed. It clearly didn't look like a room that had simply been closed since the afternoon. The officer then shined his flashlight on the lower part of the wall separating the 2 rooms. From the room 18 side, the small hole Emily had found was much more obvious. There was an area of the baseboard that looked like it had been recently tampered with, and lying beside it was a thin piece of metal that looked like a small screwdriver. When I told him about the paper we'd placed over the hole on our side, the officer crouched down and looked through it. Then he stood up and said you could see part of our room through it, especially the area near the second bed. The front desk employee came into the room while the officers were still there and looked just as nervous as I felt. He explained that room 18 had been cleaned earlier that afternoon, but then a maintenance worker confirmed that the air conditioner would need a new part, so the room had been blocked in the system. According to him, nobody should have entered after that. The officers asked who had access to the keys, and that was when the situation got worse. The motel still used an older system where employees could program master key cards to open multiple rooms. The man said there had been 3 employees working that day, along with 1 maintenance person, and that some of the cards were kept behind the front desk. When one of the officers asked if all of them were there, he realized that one of the master cards wasn't where it was supposed to be. I don't know if they ever found out who took it. At the time, though, it explained how someone had managed to open our door while I was at the front desk. One of the officers also checked the lock and confirmed that it didn't appear to have been forced. That meant the person had probably used a valid key card. Emily was extremely shaken when she heard that. She asked what would have happened if I hadn't put the security latch on before leaving. I didn't answer because I was thinking exactly the same thing. If that latch hadn't been secured, the door would have opened completely, and my daughter would have been alone in the room with someone who, from everything we could tell, had spent part of the night hiding next door, watching or listening to what we were doing. We didn't stay there. The officers recommended that we find somewhere else to spend the night, and the employee refunded the cost of the room without me even having to ask. One of the officers stayed near our room while we gathered our bags and carried everything to the car. I didn't leave Emily alone even for a few seconds. Before we left, one of the officers took my phone and wrote down my information so they could contact me if they needed anything else. He also said they were going to review the motel's security cameras. We eventually found a chain hotel almost an hour later, closer to a busier area, and slept for maybe 2 hours. The next morning, I received a call from one of the officers. The exterior cameras had recorded a man quickly leaving through the back of the motel, just a few minutes before the police arrived. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify his face, but he appeared to have come from the area around rooms 17 and 18 and crossed an empty lot before disappearing. The officer didn't want to say that he was an employee or someone connected to the motel because they were still investigating. I never received another call, and I never found out who he was. Emily is an adult now, but she still mentions that night from time to time. The detail that continues to bother me is the sequence of everything that happened. The person in room 18 apparently knew that I had left and that Emily was alone. He tried our door during the exact few minutes I was at the front desk. That could have been a coincidence, but I've never been able to believe it was. As far as I'm concerned, someone in that room had been paying attention to us from the moment we arrived. Story 2. My wife and I were living in Charlotte, North Carolina when this happened. I was 28 years old. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and she, Claire, was 27. We were both working way too much that summer and had canceled a bigger trip because of work, so we decided to at least spend 3 nights near Myrtle Beach. We found a small house to rent on a vacation rental platform in a residential area a few minutes inland from the beach. We chose it specifically because we didn't want to stay in a hotel or in the middle of the busiest part of town. The street was quiet, with low houses, small lawns, and cars with license plates from several different states, so it was obvious that a lot of the properties there were rented out during the summer. The house we rented had 2 bedrooms, a small living room connected to the kitchen, and a back door that opened onto a deck surrounded by a wooden privacy screen. We arrived shortly after 3 in the afternoon, using a code the host had sent us to open a lockbox attached beside the door. Inside was a regular key. Everything matched the photos in the listing, and we had no trouble getting inside. We spent the rest of the afternoon buying food, putting our things in the bedrooms, and then went for a walk on the beach. We came back around 7:30, while there was still plenty of daylight outside. I was making burgers in the kitchen while Claire was taking a shower when I heard someone knock on the front door. I thought it might be a neighbor, or maybe someone from the rental management. When I opened it, there was a man who looked to be in his early 50s standing on the porch. A woman around the same age was standing a few steps behind him, near the entrance to the yard. The man was polite from the beginning, which made the whole thing even stranger. He asked if we were staying at the house and then wanted to know when we planned to leave. I told him we'd just arrived and would be staying until Monday. He stared at me for a few seconds and asked who had authorized it. At that point, Claire appeared behind me, still drying her hair with a towel, and I asked what exactly the problem was. The man said that the house belonged to his family and that nobody was supposed to be staying there that week. He wasn't yelling and didn't try to come inside. He seemed more confused than angry. I thought there might have been some mistake with the rental platform, so I took out my phone and opened the reservation. I showed him the address, the dates, the photos of the house, and the host's name. When he saw the name, his expression changed slightly, but he didn't explain why. The woman, who hadn't said anything until then, stepped closer and briefly looked at the screen too. I asked if they knew the owner listed on the reservation. The man only said that this needed to be sorted out, and asked again whether we'd been given a key. I said yes through the lockbox beside the door. He looked at the box for a few seconds, then thanked me, and said there had probably been some kind of misunderstanding. The 2 of them went back to a dark-colored sedan parked across the street and drove away. Claire closed the door and asked what I thought had happened. I said it was probably some confusion between family members who managed the property. Even so, I immediately locked the door and sent the host a message asking if everything was okay with our reservation. The host took about 20 minutes to respond. While we waited, Claire started searching the address and the name listed on the reservation, trying to find out if there was anything strange about the house. We couldn't find anything other than the listing itself and a few public records that we couldn't really make sense of on our phones. Then a message came through saying that our reservation was correct and that we didn't need to worry. I explained that a couple had shown up claiming the house belonged to their family. The next response took a little longer. The host asked what they looked like and whether they'd tried to get inside. I described both of them and said no, they'd only asked a few questions and left. He replied that he knew relatives of the previous owner and that there was sometimes confusion involving the property, but assured us that we had permission to be there. I directly asked whether those people had a key. He didn't answer that part. He only told us to keep the doors locked and let him know if they came back. That was enough to make Claire uncomfortable. She wanted to leave that same night, but I thought that would be an overreaction. The couple hadn't threatened anyone, it was already dark. We'd driven several hours that day and the reservation was paid for. We agreed that if anything else strange happened, we would leave. Before going to bed, I checked the front door, the back door, and every window. The back door had a regular keyed lock along with a small security chain installed higher up. I secured both. I also left the outside lights on. When I went to the bedroom, I spent a few more minutes looking out the window at the street, but the sedan we'd seen earlier wasn't there. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. The bedroom was completely dark, and for a few seconds I didn't even remember where I was. The central air conditioning was running and making that constant noise through the vents. Then I heard a metallic sound coming from the back of the house. It was quiet, like a key touching a lock. I stayed still, trying to decide whether I'd actually heard it or if I was half asleep. A few seconds later, there was another sound, this time very clear, the handle on the back door moving. Claire woke up when I sat up in bed and asked what was happening. I motioned for her to be quiet. Then we heard a click. I was certain I'd locked that door. I got out of bed without turning on any lights and went to the bedroom doorway. From there, I could see part of the hallway and, at the end of it, a small section of the kitchen where the back door was located. The outside light came through the window in the door and provided just enough illumination to make out shapes. I saw the handle slowly turn. The door opened a few inches and stopped when the security chain pulled tight. For a moment, I thought that would stop whoever was outside. Then a hand appeared through the opening. The person pushed the door against the chain, reached their fingers inside, and lifted the latch until it came loose. The door opened. The man who had appeared on the porch that afternoon stepped into the kitchen with a key in his hand. He didn't seem to be looking for anything or trying to move quickly and quietly. He walked in slowly, partially closed the door behind him, and stood there looking into the house. I immediately backed into the bedroom and pulled the door almost closed without shutting it completely, because I didn't want the doorknob to click. Claire was already standing, and when she saw my expression, she understood that someone had come inside. I whispered that it was the same man from earlier and told her to get her phone. My hands were shaking so badly that I had trouble unlocking mine. I called 911 and held the phone against my ear, trying to speak as quietly as possible. I gave our address, explained that we were staying in a rental house, and said that a man we didn't know had just entered using a key. The dispatcher asked if he was armed. I didn't know. She asked where he was at that moment, and I realized I couldn't hear him anymore. That scared me more than hearing footsteps would have. Claire and I stayed near the wall beside the bed while I kept my eyes on the small opening in the door. After a few seconds, I heard the kitchen floor creak. Then came 2 slow footsteps toward the living room. The dispatcher told us to lock ourselves in the bedroom if possible. The door had a simple lock on the knob, so I closed it as carefully as I could and turned the lock. Claire pushed a chair from near the desk against the doorknob. That was when she pointed toward the bedroom window. Through the gap between the curtain and the glass, we could see part of the street. The dark sedan was parked a little farther down from the house with its lights off. The woman who had been with the man earlier was standing outside near the driver's door. She wasn't looking at the house. She kept turning her head from side to side, watching the street. That eliminated any possibility that I could believe he'd entered by mistake. If he really was just some confused owner wanting to check the house, there was no reason to come inside after midnight while another person stayed outside watching to see if anyone was coming. I told the dispatcher what I was seeing, and she said units were already on the way. While we were talking, we heard the man walking around the living room. He wasn't calling out to anyone or saying he was the owner. He was just walking slowly. At one point, I heard a drawer open in the kitchen and then close again. Claire was gripping my arm so tightly that her nails were pressing into my skin. Then the footsteps entered the hallway. First, there was a creak near the bathroom. Then another one closer to our bedroom. I started looking for something I could use if he opened the door and grabbed the small lamp from the nightstand, yanking the cord out of the outlet. I knew it probably wouldn't do much, but it was the only heavy object within reach. The footsteps stopped outside the door. Both of us stayed completely still. I could hear my own breathing and the air coming through the vent above the bed. The doorknob moved once. The man pressed it down slowly, realized it was locked, and let go. He stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he tried again, this time pushing the door with a little more force. The chair scraped a few inches across the floor. Claire put her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. After that, he simply stopped. We waited for another attempt, but it never came. For almost a minute, we heard nothing on the other side of the door. The dispatcher stayed on the line and kept telling us not to leave the bedroom. I wanted to ask how long the police would take, but I was afraid of speaking loudly enough for the man to hear me. Then we heard the floor creak again, except this time the footsteps began moving away down the hallway. They went into the living room and stopped. Claire was still looking through the gap in the curtain and whispered that the woman had gotten into the car. A few seconds later, I heard the back door open. The man didn't slam the door or run. I only heard the hinges creak, followed by the sound of the outer screen door closing. I went to the window but stayed off to the side so I wouldn't be visible. The sedan was sitting in the street, and the woman was now in the driver's seat. The man appeared from the side of the house, walked quickly to the passenger side, and got in. At that moment, I heard a siren very far away. The car pulled away before its headlights were even turned on. It traveled halfway down the street in the dark before the lights finally came on. I gave the dispatcher the direction they were heading and tried to describe the vehicle, but I couldn't see the license plate from that distance. Even after the car disappeared, we didn't open the bedroom door. About 3 minutes later, red and blue lights began reflecting across the ceiling. 2 officers arrived from the front, while another vehicle continued down the street in the direction the couple had fled. We only came out when the dispatcher confirmed that officers were on the property, and one of them announced the name of the department from outside the bedroom. The first thing the officers checked was the back door. There was no sign of forced entry. The lock worked normally, and the key we'd been given was still with us. I showed them how I'd secured the chain before going to sleep, and explained how I'd watched the man release it through the opening. One of the officers said that type of chain offered very little security if the door could be opened a few inches. Then they went through the house looking for anything that had been disturbed. In the kitchen, a utensil drawer was open a few inches, and the cabinet door beneath the sink was also slightly open. It didn't seem like he'd been looking for money or electronics. Our phones, wallets, and Claire's purse were in the bedroom with us, so we didn't know if anything had been taken. The officer asked about the visit that afternoon and wanted to see the entire conversation with the host. When he read the message about relatives of the previous owner, he asked me to send screenshots. Then we called the host in front of them. This time he answered. The officer took over the call and started asking questions about who had keys to the property and who the people were who had shown up earlier. I could only hear part of the conversation, but it became clear that the host knew the man. After a few minutes, the officer hung up and explained that there was a family dispute involving the house. The property had belonged to that man's mother, but apparently it had passed to another relative after she died. The man wasn't authorized to manage or use the property, but nobody knew that he still had a copy of the key. The police managed to locate the sedan about 20 minutes later at a gas station a few miles away. One of the officers came back to let us know while another remained on the phone with the host. The man and woman had been identified, but the officer didn't go into much detail at that point. He only said that both of them claimed they'd gone to the house because they believed the rental was unauthorized and wanted to check whether anyone was staying there. When I asked why that required entering in the middle of the night, he said that was exactly what they were trying to clarify. The man claimed that he still considered the property to belong to the family and that he'd used an old key to enter. He also said he didn't know we were in the bedroom, which made no sense at all because he'd spoken to us in person only a few hours earlier. I told the officer that he'd specifically asked when we planned to leave and whether we'd been given a key. The officer wrote that down again. The woman apparently said she'd stayed near the car because she didn't want to enter the property. I don't know whether they planned to steal something, scare us into leaving, or do something else. None of those possibilities were confirmed that night. What was clear was that they knew we were there and still decided to come back when all the lights were off. After speaking with the police, there was no chance we were staying in that house. We packed our things while an officer remained outside. My body still tensed up every time I walked through the hallway where I'd seen the man. Claire didn't want to be alone even to get her things from the bathroom. We left shortly before 3 in the morning and went to a hotel closer to the beach. The host refunded the reservation the next day and later sent a message saying that all the locks on the house would be replaced. He also temporarily removed the listing. We had a few more conversations with the police over the following weeks, but we never received an explanation that really answered what I wanted to know most. Apparently, there really was an old dispute over the property, and the man had kept a key without the person responsible for the rentals knowing about it. That explains how he got inside, but it doesn't explain the timing or their behavior. If he simply believed he had some right to the house, he could have called the police when he saw our reservation, or come back during the day. Instead, he waited until we thought the problem was over, came inside after we'd gone to sleep, and silently walked through the house while the woman watched the street. Claire and I still take short trips, but we've never stayed in another vacation rental without checking every entrance as soon as we arrive. I also carry a portable door lock to use at night. What stayed with me most from that experience was realizing that I'd done everything I would normally consider enough. I had a legitimate reservation, a key provided by the host, and every door was locked. Even so, someone else had a key to that house, and we only found out when I woke up and watched that door open in the dark. Story 3. My younger brother and I used to take short road trips every summer when we were still in college. This happened when I was 24 and he was 21. My name is Tyler Bennett, and his name is Mason. We grew up near Lexington, Kentucky, and at the time I was already working full-time at an auto repair shop while Mason was still finishing college. That summer we managed to get 4 days off at the same time and decided to drive through Tennessee without planning much beyond a few places where we wanted to fish and hike. On the second afternoon of the trip, we found a small camping area near a river in a rural area a few hours from Knoxville. It wasn't one of those campgrounds with a front office, showers, or RV hookups. There was only a narrow gravel road leading into the woods and a few flat sites separated by trees, each with a picnic table and a stone fire ring. When we arrived, we only saw one other occupied campsite far away from ours, almost at the beginning of the road. We chose a spot near the water because we planned to fish before dark. The car was parked about 20 yards behind the tent in a small dirt area beside the road. It was extremely hot, with that heavy humidity typical of a Tennessee summer. By the time we finished setting up the tent, my shirt was already sticking to my back. The river was wide, but in that section it seemed relatively calm, with rocks sticking out in a few places and trees covering almost the entire opposite bank. At the time, the place seemed exactly like what we wanted: quiet, cheap, and far away from any town. We started fishing in the late afternoon, maybe around 6:30. Mason went a few yards downstream while I stayed near a shallower section. He was the one who noticed the man first. Mason called my name and discreetly pointed toward the opposite bank. There was a guy sitting near the water between two trees. He was far enough away that I couldn't make out his face, but he looked like an adult man wearing a dark t-shirt or shirt and a baseball cap. There was no fishing rod, backpack, cooler, or tent anywhere near him. He was simply sitting on a rock looking toward our side of the river. I waved once to be polite. He didn't respond. I kept fishing and tried not to think much about it. He could have been someone who lived in the area, or who had reached that spot by some trail on the other side. About 15 minutes later, I looked again, and he was still sitting in exactly the same position. Mason asked if I thought it was strange, and I said yes, but that it didn't necessarily mean anything. The problem was that every time I looked at him, he seemed to be staring directly at us. Not at the river or anything around us, at us. By the time we started packing up our things, the sun was already disappearing behind the trees and the temperature had dropped a little. The man still hadn't moved. We went back to the campsite and started a small fire. From the picnic table, we could still see part of the opposite bank through the trees. A few minutes later, when I looked again, the rock where he'd been sitting was empty. I felt relieved and assumed he'd simply left before it got dark. Once it became completely dark, it was difficult to see anything beyond our own campsite. The fire lit up the table, the front of the tent, and a few nearby trees, but beyond that, everything turned into darkness. The river was still easy to locate by the sound of the water moving over the rocks, although from where we were, we could no longer see the opposite bank. We cooked some food on a small grill over the fire and sat around talking for a while. It was maybe around 9:30 when Mason pointed toward the other side of the river. There was a white light between the trees. It looked like a flashlight. It stayed still for a few seconds, and then disappeared. I immediately thought about the man we'd seen earlier, but I said it could be anyone walking along a trail. About 10 minutes later, the light appeared again, this time much farther to the left. It moved slowly near the riverbank and then went out again. It didn't look like someone normally walking with a flashlight because the beam almost never pointed toward the ground. It was as if the person only turned it on for a few seconds, looked at something, and then switched it off. Mason asked if I thought the man was still watching our campsite. I said there was no way to know, but I was starting to feel uncomfortable too. The fire made us completely visible while we could barely see anything on the other side. I turned off the flashlight that was sitting on the table, and we let the fire die down. After that, we spent a few minutes watching the opposite bank. The light appeared a third time, now farther upstream. It stayed on for maybe 5 seconds and then disappeared. We didn't see anything else for almost half an hour. Around 11, we decided to get into the tent. Before that, I walked to the car to put away the fishing rods and most of the food. I'd heard enough stories about animals getting into campsites that I didn't want to leave anything with a strong smell near where we'd be sleeping. While I was putting everything in the trunk, I kept looking at the gravel road behind the car. There was no lighting anywhere in that place, and I could only see as far as my flashlight reached. Everything was quiet. When I got back to the tent, Mason asked if I'd seen the light again. I said no. We zipped up the entrance, kept our shoes inside, and tried to sleep. For a while, I stayed awake listening to the river and the insects. Every now and then, a branch would fall or something small would move through the leaves, but nothing sounded close enough to worry about. I think I started falling asleep around midnight. I don't know how long I slept before waking up, but the fire had completely gone out and it was much cooler inside the tent. What woke me was a sound different from the constant noise of the river. It sounded like water being disturbed very close to the bank, like when someone steps into a shallow section and moves rocks with their feet. I opened my eyes and lay there trying to listen more carefully. The sound stopped. I thought it might be an animal. Then I heard it again, this time accompanied by what sounded like a foot dragging across wet gravel. The noise was coming from the direction of the water and was much closer than anything we'd heard during the night. I stayed completely still for a few seconds, trying to decide whether to wake Mason. He was sleeping on his side less than 3 feet away from me. Then I heard a small crack near the picnic table and touched his shoulder. Mason woke up startled, and I put a finger to my lips before he could ask anything. I whispered that I'd heard something near the water. We both stayed silent. The river continued making the same constant noise in the background, but now there was another sound in the campsite. A brief sound of leaves being pressed down, followed by a few seconds of silence. Then another. It sounded like someone or some animal moving slowly. I picked up my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Mason asked if I thought it could be a raccoon or a deer. I said yes, although I wasn't convinced. The tent had a small ventilation opening near the top, but from there I could only see branches and a patch of sky. I decided to look through the entrance. I grabbed the zipper and slowly opened it just enough to see the ground outside. The first thing I saw was a dark mark in the dirt near the tent. I opened it a few more inches and realized there were several drops of water leading toward the table. Then I saw 2 boots on the ground near the fire ring. They were dark, large, and completely soaked. Water was still dripping from them and had formed small patches on the dry ground. They weren't ours. I stared at them for a few seconds without understanding until I realized they were empty. Someone had taken those boots off there. I slowly closed the zipper and turned toward Mason. I think he immediately realized something was wrong because he sat up and asked what I'd seen. I barely whispered that there was a pair of wet boots outside. He stared at me like he didn't understand. I explained that they were near the fire ring and that there were watermarks coming from the direction of the river. Mason grabbed his phone and tried to see if we had a signal. There was only one bar appearing and disappearing. While he tried to open the calling app, I heard another noise, this time behind the tent. It was very faint, like a branch slowly being pressed until it snapped. We both froze. I felt my stomach tighten because at that moment I started connecting it to the man on the opposite bank. We hadn't seen anyone on our side since we'd arrived, and the boots were soaked as if someone had just come out of the water. Our car was parked behind the tent, exactly in the direction the sound had come from. To reach it, we'd have to go outside and walk about 20 yards without knowing where that person was. Mason managed to start a call to 911, but it dropped before it connected. He tried again and nothing happened. I opened the zipper one more time, this time looking toward the side where the car should have been. There were wet marks crossing the dirt near the table and leading directly toward the trees between the tent and the parking area. The footprints disappeared into the darkness a few yards later. Whoever had left those boots had crossed through our campsite and was now somewhere between us and the car. Our first thought was to stay inside the tent and wait until we could get the call through, but the more I thought about it, the less safe that seemed. A tent offers no protection at all if someone decides to come inside. I had a small folding knife in my backpack and held onto it, but I knew I didn't want to get anywhere near whoever was outside. Mason kept trying the phone while I listened. After maybe a minute, we heard something touch the car. It was a short metallic sound like a hand or an object touching the side of it. Then came a click that I recognized immediately. One of the door handles being pulled. I'd locked the car when I put away the fishing rods. Mason looked at me and whispered that we needed to get out of there. His phone finally showed 2 bars of signal, and he managed to complete the call. He quickly explained that we were camping near the river, that someone was walking around our campsite, and that we didn't know exactly where we were other than the name of the road and a sign we'd seen at the entrance. The dispatcher was able to roughly locate the area, but said it would take some time for a unit to arrive. While Mason was talking, I heard the car door handle being pulled again. Then there was silence. A few seconds later, something passed very close to the side of the tent. It didn't touch the fabric, but I heard light footsteps on dry leaves less than 6 feet from my head. The person was barefoot or wearing something much quieter than those boots. I held my breath and stared at the fabric, expecting to see a shadow. Nothing appeared. The dispatcher told us to stay where we were if leaving meant passing near the person, so we stayed. They were probably the longest 15 minutes of my life. At times we heard absolutely nothing except the river. Then a small noise would come from another part of the campsite. Once we heard someone messing with the lid of our cooler, which was empty and had been left near the table. Another time, there was a sound behind the car. The person never spoke. They never called out to us or tried to open the tent. That was what made me the most nervous, because it seemed like they knew perfectly well that we were awake and were deliberately avoiding being seen. At one point, Mason pointed toward the side of the tent. A white light appeared through the fabric for a second, very faint, and disappeared. It was clearly a flashlight being turned on outside. I immediately thought about the lights we'd seen on the opposite bank. There was no way to prove it was the same man, but I couldn't think of any other explanation anymore. About 5 minutes later, we heard quick footsteps heading toward the river. They stopped near the bank. Then there was a loud splash, followed by several smaller ones. I almost opened the tent to look, but the dispatcher told us not to. We waited. Not long after that, we started hearing a vehicle approaching along the gravel road. Headlights moved through the trees and illuminated part of the campsite. Only then did we come out of the tent with our hands visible, as a police officer got out of the vehicle and pointed his flashlight toward us. The officer asked us to stay near the tent while he checked the area. I immediately showed him the boots near the fire ring and explained that they didn't belong to us. With his flashlight, we could see much more of the ground than before. There were barefoot prints mixed with wet patches in the dirt, although some were already difficult to make out. They came from the riverbank, passed near the table, and continued toward the car. The officer found handprints and watermarks on the driver's door and the trunk lid. Nothing had been opened because the vehicle was still locked. Then he walked to the riverbank and shined his light across the water. There was nobody on our side. I told him about the man we'd seen during the afternoon and the lights that had appeared after dark. The officer asked exactly where he'd been sitting. I pointed toward an area on the opposite bank, but in the darkness it was difficult to identify the exact spot. He shined a flashlight much stronger than ours toward the other side. For a few seconds, we didn't see anything. Then Mason noticed movement between 2 trees. A small light appeared and immediately went out. The officer called someone over the radio and requested another unit to check a road that, according to him, provided access to the opposite bank. He also told us something I hadn't known. In that section, The river became much shallower a few dozen yards upstream from the campsite. Depending on the water level, an adult could cross it on foot, although doing so at night would still be dangerous. That explained why we'd heard water without seeing or hearing a boat or motor. We didn't want to wait until morning. As soon as the officer finished checking around the car, we packed up only what we could quickly put away. We shoved the entire tent into the trunk, practically crumpled up, along with our backpacks, and left the cooler and a few smaller things behind to pick up later. The officer stayed there while we did it. Before leaving, I asked what would happen to the boots. He said he was going to collect them and file a report about what had happened, especially because someone had entered our campsite and messed with the vehicle. Another unit went to the access point on the other side of the river but didn't find anyone. We drove to a 24-hour gas station and stayed there until daylight. The next morning, we went back with an employee from the area to pick up the rest of our things. There was nothing else strange at the campsite. We never found out who that man was, and no one was ever identified afterward. Maybe he was someone from the area trying to scare us, someone temporarily living in the woods, or simply a person with some kind of problem who decided to cross the river for a reason we'll never understand. What I can't explain is why he took off his boots when he reached our side and left them right in the middle of the campsite. I also can't forget that when we saw that flashlight changing positions on the opposite bank, we were probably watching someone looking for a place to cross. At the time, I thought he was only watching us. Now I think he'd already decided to come over to our side. Story 4. I was 23 years old when this happened, and until that trip I had never had any problems traveling alone. My name is Lauren Hayes. I was living in Sacramento at the time, and I had just finished my first year working at a clinic after college. 2 friends and I had planned to spend 4 days in San Diego during our summer vacation, but both of them canceled practically at the last minute. One of them got sick, and the other ended up having a family problem. Since my tickets were already booked and I had managed to get those days off with a lot of difficulty, I decided to go anyway. The hotel we had booked was simple and relatively cheap, a few blocks from the beach. It wasn't exactly a bad place, just old. It had 4 floors, a tight parking lot, and partially enclosed exterior hallways with a large opening along one side that let in air from the street. My room was on the 3rd floor, almost at the end of the hallway. Nothing strange happened during the first 2 days. I spent practically the entire day outside, went to the beach, walked around the area, and came back to shower and sleep. On the 3rd night, I stayed out later in a busy area near the beach and took a rideshare back. By the time I got to the hotel, it was close to midnight. The temperature outside was still pleasant, but the hallway felt stuffy and had that mixed smell of salty ocean air, old carpet, and cleaning products. I stepped out of the elevator looking at my phone and only noticed someone near my room when I was already halfway down the hallway. It was a woman I had never seen before. She looked like she was in her late 30s, maybe 40, and was standing near the wall between my room and the next one. She was wearing shorts, a loose t-shirt, and carrying a small crossbody bag. When she saw me coming, she smiled and asked if I knew whether the front desk was still open. I said I thought it was because there had been someone behind the desk when I'd left. I kept walking, but she took a few steps toward me and explained that she'd lost her room keycard. I asked what her room number was, thinking maybe she was just trying to find the right door. She ignored the question and asked if I was staying there alone. That immediately made me uncomfortable. I only replied that I was meeting some people and continued toward my door. She then said her phone was dead and asked if she could use mine to call the front desk. I told her there was a phone near the elevator, even though I didn't actually know if that was true. I took my keycard out of my bag and opened the door. As I went inside, I looked back and noticed that she'd stopped in the hallway again. She wasn't heading toward the elevator or the front desk. She was watching me go inside. I closed the door, locked it, and also secured the metal safety latch that kept the door from opening all the way. I stood there for a few seconds, listening. I didn't hear any footsteps moving away. That was what bothered me. I waited maybe half a minute and looked through the peephole. The hallway in front of my room appeared to be empty. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting because I was alone. I put my bag on the chair, took off my shoes, and went to get a bottle of water from the small refrigerator. I was still thinking about her asking whether I was staying alone. Maybe it had just been conversation, but it was a strange question to ask someone you'd just met in a hotel hallway close to midnight. I picked up my phone and sent a message to one of my friends saying I'd run into a weird woman at the hotel. She replied almost immediately and told me not to open the door for anyone. I actually laughed when I read it because it seemed obvious. About 5 minutes later, while I was getting some clothes ready to take a shower, someone knocked on the door. There were 2 firm knocks, not very loud. I immediately froze. I didn't go to the door right away. I asked who it was from where I was standing, and a man's voice answered that he was from the front desk. He said they'd received a complaint about a water leak and needed to check my bathroom. I asked what leak he was talking about. He said water was showing up in the room below mine and that it would only take a minute. For a second, I actually considered opening the door. The hotel was old and a plumbing problem didn't seem impossible, but I remembered the woman in the hallway and thought it was too much of a coincidence for that to happen only a few minutes later. I told the man to wait while I called the front desk. He only said, "Okay." I didn't hear any footsteps moving away. I used the room phone instead of my cell phone because I wanted to make sure I was calling the lobby directly. A woman answered, and I explained that there was an employee at my door who wanted to check a leak. She went quiet for a moment and asked for my room number. When I told her, she said there was no maintenance order and that no one from the staff had been sent to the 3rd floor. My stomach tightened immediately. I asked if she was sure, and she said yes. She told me to keep the door locked and said she would call hotel security. While I still had the phone against my ear, I slowly walked toward the peephole. At first, I could only see part of the hallway and the shoulder of a man standing very close to the door. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, not a uniform. I couldn't see his face because he was standing slightly off to the side. Then he stepped back half a step and I could see more of the hallway behind him. That was when I saw the woman. She was almost at the end of the hallway, partially hidden near an ice machine. Only part of her body was visible. As I watched, she raised one hand and made a small motion with her fingers toward the man, as if telling him to wait. He turned his head slightly to look at her. That was when I understood that they were together. I quietly told the front desk employee that the woman who had approached me earlier was in the hallway and seemed to be signaling to the man standing outside my door. The employee told me to move away from the door and go as far from it as possible while she called security and the police. I carried the room phone as far as the cord would allow and stayed near the bed. My cell phone was in my hand and I already had the screen open so I could call 911 if I needed to. On the other side of the door, the man knocked again. This time there were 3 harder knocks. He said he needed to come in immediately because the leak could cause damage to the floor below. I didn't answer. A few seconds later, he tried the door handle. First, he pushed it down once, then again with more force. I could clearly hear the lock mechanism moving. The interior safety latch was still secured, but at that point I started wondering if it would be enough. I pushed my large suitcase against the door and put the desk chair behind it. The woman from the front desk was still talking to me and told me not to confront them or tell them that I knew they didn't work for the hotel. The man stopped moving the handle and went silent. Then I heard a woman's voice speaking very quietly outside. I couldn't understand the words, but I recognized the voice of the woman from the hallway. After that, there was a small metallic sound near the lock. It didn't sound like a key being inserted normally. It was more like something scraping against the metal. I stared at the door, waiting for it to move. My heart was beating so fast that my hands started tingling. At that point, I wasn't thinking about robbery or some kind of scam anymore. I just wanted someone to get there before they managed to come inside. After maybe a minute, I heard quick footsteps coming from the direction of the elevator, and a man's voice asking what was going on. The metallic sound stopped immediately. There was a brief argument in the hallway. A man said he was security and told someone to stay where they were. Then I heard footsteps running in the opposite direction. I rushed to the peephole but still didn't open the door. I saw the hotel security guard passing my room, chasing the man in the gray t-shirt. The woman was no longer near the ice machine. A few seconds later, I heard an emergency door slam at the end of the hallway. The front desk employee confirmed over the phone that security was there and told me to remain inside the room until the police arrived. I kept watching through the peephole and saw the security guard return alone less than 2 minutes later. He appeared to be talking over his radio. Then he stopped in front of my door and said my first name. Even then, I asked the front desk to confirm that it really was him before moving the things away from the door. When I finally opened it, the hallway was empty. The security guard explained that he'd seen a man and a woman running down the exterior stairs. He tried to follow them, but they reached the parking lot before he did. According to him, they got into a car that was already parked near the exit and drove away before he could get the full license plate number. The police arrived shortly afterward, and 2 officers spoke with me inside the room while another went to check the hotel's security cameras. I told them everything from the moment I stepped out of the elevator and found the woman near my door. One of the officers asked me several times exactly what she'd said, especially whether she'd asked if I was alone and whether she'd asked to use my phone. When I confirmed that she had, he said it probably hadn't been a random conversation. His impression was that she was trying to find out whether there was anyone else in the room or whether someone might show up while they were there. The security guard also showed the officers the lock. There were some recent marks near the card reader, but there was no way to say whether they'd been made that night. What really scared me was what they found when they checked the cameras. The woman appeared entering the hotel about 15 minutes before I returned. She hadn't used a guest key card because someone was leaving through the side door at that moment, and she simply held the door before it closed. The man came in through the same entrance a few minutes later. Neither of them went through the front desk. Then a camera on the 3rd floor showed the woman slowly walking down the hallway and stopping near different doors. By the time I stepped out of the elevator, she'd already been near my room for several minutes. The officers recommended that I not stay in that room, and I immediately agreed. The hotel offered me another room on a different floor, but I no longer felt safe there. I called a larger hotel a few miles away and managed to get a room. One of the officers waited while I packed my things, and the security guard escorted me to the car I'd ordered through the app. I barely slept that night. The next day, I received a call from a hotel employee saying they'd reviewed more of the security footage. The couple had spent some time in the parking lot before going inside and appeared to be watching people who arrived alone. They weren't able to identify the 2 of them from the footage alone, and as far as I know, no one was ever arrested for it. I don't know exactly what they intended to do if I'd opened the door. Maybe they wanted to rob the room. Maybe they expected me to let the man inside because I believed he was an employee, and then the woman would appear afterward. I never got an answer. What stayed with me was the fact that everything started with one very simple question. When that woman asked if I was staying alone, I thought she was just strange and intrusive. Now I'm certain she was trying to find out exactly that. If I hadn't called the front desk before opening the door, I probably would have let a man who didn't work at that hotel into my room while the person who had chosen my room stood in the hallway watching.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.